Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Lowenberg, producing director of LA Theater Works. Today's conversation with Ken Narasaki is presented by the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program, a state-funded grant project of the California State Library. In addition to being a playwright, Ken is a distinguished actor whose resume includes a Lucille Lortel Award nomination for his performance in Greater Clements at Lincoln Center. He's also the former literary manager of East West Players in Los Angeles, the nation's longest-running Asian American theater. As a writer, his plays include Ghosts and Baggage, The Mikado Project, and No No Boy, which LA Theater Works recorded in 2021. And today, we're proud to present his play, Innocent When You Dream, which earned him the 2006 Pacific Rim Playwrights Award. Ken Narasaki, welcome to LA Theater Works.
Thank you, Susan.
Let's start from the beginning. Where does the title, Innocent When You Dream, come from?
Well, I think fans of Tom Waits will recognize the title. It's from his song, I think it was 1987, Innocent When You Dream. And the tone of the song really kind of spoke to what I wanted to present with the play. There's sort of a feeling of regret, of memory, and those were things I wanted to have in there. Even though I don't use the song in the play itself, I don't think we could have afforded the usage rights. But there was a couple lines like. Let me see. It's such a sad old feeling. The fields are soft and green. It's memories that I'm stealing, but you're innocent when you dream.
Oh, so beautiful.
Yeah. And that was actually part of the inspiration for the play. I mean, there were a number of inspirations, but that was one of them.
Well, there's another song, Blue Skies, which appears throughout the play in different forms. Why did you choose that song, and what does it mean to you personally?
Well, this is kind of funny because it came pretty late in the rehearsal process. I think I was looking for pre-show music, so I was looking for period music that would sort of set the mood. And then I came across Blue Skies, and the first two lines, blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see, just sort of reminded me of the kind of optimism that the Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans, must have had to come back and say, we're going to build our lives from scratch, and we're going to have nice lives, and we're not going to focus on the past, which kind of brings me to the last two lines: blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now on. I thought that also kind of captured the feeling of getting out of these concentration camps and in a period of intense racism against them, and just charting a positive path forward, which by and large, many of them did.
Yeah, I mean, for returning Japanese American veterans and their families released from the internment camps, it must have been a very difficult period after the war. Starting over in a world they didn't recognize. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how people adjusted to this harsh new reality?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it runs the gamut. But I know that a lot of people who returned to the West Coast experienced immediate racism. Some of them had everything taken away from them and had nothing. They were starting literally from scratch. Other people had to endure having, racial epithets spray painted on their houses, windows broken, being yelled at, it was. I'm sure it wasn't easy. I think a lot of them dealt with it by turning inward, into their own community and forming, filling the needs that they wouldn't get from the outside community by themselves. one instance I can think of is my dad helped build the Nisei Veterans Club in Seattle. And it was him and all these returning Nisei soldiers building a place where they could just basically hang out. And it was because the veterans of foreign wars wouldn't let them have a chapter. So I thought that was like a really black and white example of how they dealt with external racism.
Ken, speaking of your dad, he was an Army vet who fought in the legendary 442nd Regiment and was one of the many people of Japanese descent who were sent to relocation centers during World War II.
That's right.
How did his experience shape Innocent When You Dream?
Well, he, like so many Nisei, he almost never spoke about his experiences. In fact, he always kind of downplayed his experience in the war, which years later, I was listening to an interview of him by this Densho project, which was interviewing vets before they died. Basically, they wanted to get their stories on tape. And there were all these crazy stories that he never told us. But every once in a while, he would say something. And one of the things he said once was that all he wanted when he got back was to have a normal life, to get married and have a family, and just live a normal life, which is actually a line in the play, and it actually informed a couple of Dan's speeches in the play. Another story he told me was that when he was in Italy towards the end of the war, and then after the war ended, they stayed another 6 months to clean up. And he said on the day before they're going to get shipped back, one of his friends said, "They expect us to go back home and live a normal life? I don't even know what that is anymore." And then later on, he said that the guy killed himself. So there were just these little stories that I'd hear that would just kind of open up a vast sort of understanding of the kinds of pressures and existential pressures that they felt coming back. And you realize these guys were 18, 19, 20 years old. They were kids, basically. And they just undergone this incredible trauma.
In the play, Dan, a U.S. Army veteran, gets into an altercation with Frank, who's a no-no boy who refused to sign the loyalty oath. Can you give us a brief history of the no-no boys and how they were viewed in the community?
Well, the term no-no boy comes from this loyalty oath that I think everyone in the camps had to sign, but men of draft age had a couple of extra questions they had to sign, which was, do you forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor? Which a lot of them said, this is a trick question. I never had any allegiance, so how can I forswear it? And another one was, will you fight in the U.S. Army wherever ordered? And some of them said, as long as my family is in concentration camps, no, I won't. So about 10% of the draft age men signed no to those two questions, and that's how they got the name. They later kind of got grouped with all these draft resistors who, might have signed yes, yes, or yes, no, but once they were drafted, they refused to go, and they were actually something a little legally, they were something different. And a lot of those guys went to prison.
I was about to say a lot of them served time in jail.
Right. Yeah. Like they went to places like McNeil Island Penitentiary and just some very bad places.
Yeah.
And they were kept there until maybe a year after the war ended. But they all got grouped under the rubric no-no boys. And a lot of the Japanese American community turned their backs on them and viewed them as traitors. I know a lot of vets, like my dad, felt like they were angry too. They thought what happened to them was wrong also, but they went and fought anyway to prove their loyalty and, in their minds, make life better for succeeding generations. So there was a huge split between the two groups.
Was there any special restitution given to Japanese families after the war?
Yeah, in the late 80s, During the Reagan administration, of all things, the Japanese Americans really fought hard and lobbied Congress hard for reparations for the many people who lost everything. And it was a tough fight, especially because, and led mostly by the Sansei, basically my generation, who had to persuade their parents who actually were there to speak up. And this was a generation that never spoke about it. This was a generation that felt like the last thing they wanted to do was to remember those days. And once they did start to speak, it was a flood. There was a flood of emotions. And the flood appeared in front of this congressional hearing. And Ronald Reagan, who had actually, I think, had in some capacity spoken to the 442 coming back, remembered that experience. And it was actually his successor, George H.W. Bush, who signed the reparations into law, which was like, at the time when the Japanese Americans were fighting for this, everyone was saying, this is never going to happen. You guys are fighting a losing battle. And in this political climate, forget about it. So it was all the more remarkable that it happened.
I think about it sometimes, and these marvelous, these wonderful people who just endured so much and then came back and just rebuilt their lives,
Yeah.
It's a real tribute to them.
Yeah. And getting them to open up about that again.
Yeah.
I think if you speak to anyone of my generation, you'll find that they'll all say, oh, my parents never talked about it.
Yeah.
And, for the longest time, I'd hear my parents talking about, oh, he came from this camp, or that was the guy from the other camp. And I thought, wow, summer camp must have been a really big deal when my parents were young. And it was only when I was in the 7th grade and was reading about World War II, and there's one paragraph about the Japanese internment camps and what happened. I was just enraged and, in a way, radicalized in a small way.
So that was the first time that you really understood anything about what had happened.
Yeah, and so when I asked my parents about it, they did not want to talk about it. They said, "Why do you want to know about that? There's the reason we went through that, so you wouldn't have to even think about these things." And we go, "Well, we want to know. We need to know," but they just didn't want to talk about it.
The great actor Sab Shimono, who spent time in 2 relocation centers himself, starred in the original stage version of the play as well as our recording. How did you get him to sign on to the original production?
Well, he had done my first play, Ghosts and Baggage, several years before this. And I just thought he was so amazing. And he was the first guy I thought of for Dan.
Yeah.
And because my friend Alberto Isaac was directing this play, as well as, he had directed Ghosts and Baggage and was going to direct this play, he asked Saab, and Saab agreed. And I was so happy because he was just perfect for Dan. And there's a funny story connected to this, too. The first time we read through it, he read the scene, of himself, climbing out from the old folks' home and going to the bar and having the stroke, read it beautifully. And then the scene with his 2 adult children happens. Then the flashback to the concentration camps happen. And he was just sitting there smiling and looking all around, waiting for someone else to speak. And I said, Saab, that's your line. He said, what? I thought I was just playing the old guy.
So has there been any kind of reconciliation between the No-No Boys and the soldiers or their descendants?
Well, within the descendants, of course, I think, those of us who follow just really, most of us grew up after the civil rights movement happened or during the civil rights movement. And so we all looked at the No-No Boys as heroes in a way, which, angered our, those of us whose parents were veterans, it angered them, a lot. But, we could see how both people, the veterans and the resistors, sort of stood up for Japanese American civil rights and equality. So I think amongst the descendants, I would say almost all of us, feel the same way. But in their generation, I think the split lasted for a lifetime. In my later play, the adaptation of Nono Boy, the novel Nono Boy, I spoke to some of the resistors who were still alive at the time, and they were still very angry at the veterans. And by the same token, when I spoke to the veterans, they were still angry at the Nono Boys. And I think some of them socialized. They weren't completely ostracized, but I remember my parents sometimes referring to Nono Boys in kind of a disparaging way, even though they were friends, or they ran in the same social circles. So there was some rapprochement, but I think the anger remained.
Can you talk a little bit more about the legacy of the camps and how they affected later generations?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the term intergenerational trauma. And that's basically what happened to all of us, I think. I know for the Japanese Americans, and that generation in general, there was a feeling of like you put your best face on for the world, and that meant, being happy and nice and pleasant. And that the anger, the repressed rage, that was the way they dealt with the emotions, again, the Japanese American and that generation in general, was to just shove it down. Well, it had to come out somewhere. In a lot of cases, it came out within the family, because you can do it behind closed doors, and everyone knew that you didn't speak about what happened behind those closed doors. And
so how did it? You said it came out in the family. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I know in my case, my own parents, both expressed their rage in different ways. My father in the more male way of yelling and punishing, and my mom in her way of just being unreasonably angry and blowing up for what appeared to us to be no reason. And working on this play, and then Nono Boy, and then another play I wrote which dealt more directly with intergenerational trauma, I had lots of people going, "Oh God, that's my family." And I thought, oh, we're the only ones. We're the only freaks who had these parents with these who were rageaholics. And I just talked to so many other sansei who said, "That is exactly what happened to my family." So that was really something. And it makes complete sense. I mean, they were young people when they went through this. And again, their way of dealing with it was to bury it. And I think we all know now that's like a recipe for disaster.
There's a tragic history of anti-Asian violence throughout American history, from 19th century riots to the Chinese Exclusion Act and the World War II relocation camps. And then came the pandemic, and anti-Asian hate crime soared. Did you or anyone you know experience any kind of attack?
Well, first I want to say there was another period where it surged, which was in the 1980s, when people were afraid of Japan becoming dominant over the U.S., economically dominant. And I experienced a lot of direct racism at that point. A lot of people just, calling you Jap again, like 40 years later. And it really made me realize that all it took was some geopolitical event for them to turn on us again, because we are the perpetual foreigners in this country, that no matter how many generations we've been here, we look like foreigners to, many white Americans. And so I think when the pandemic happened, and when Trump was, saying that it was the China flu, it was the Kung flu, we all knew that we were in trouble. I didn't experience anything directly, except for one, which I experienced that I thought was kind of comic at the time because it made no sense. But I was walking around the corner outside, and another guy was coming around the other corner, and he literally jumped backwards and said, "Get away from me, you Thai-looking MF."
Oh.
And I wasn't afraid because clearly he was afraid.
Yeah.
And I didn't think about it, in terms of a hate crime, but it was like, that was
Absolutely.
it came from the same place, fear. And my other friends, I knew other people who, had experiences where no one said a slur, so they couldn't say exactly whether to report it as a hate crime. But like a friend of mine was riding on the bike paths in Santa Monica, and another white guy on a bike coming towards him suddenly said something loudly about Americans, and then he spat in the general direction of my friend's bike. And my friend was going, "What the hell?" Because who spits at a bike? Who spits in the general direction of someone who's coming your way? And then he put it together: American spitting at me. Oh, and Sharon Omi, who was in the play, in the production, said that she would be walking her dog, and this one neighbor would always yell at her, for walking her dog in front of his place. And she was going, she just wrote him off as a cranky old guy, till she realized he didn't yell at anyone else who was walking their dogs past his place. So she also went, "Oh God, I can't really report this because he didn't call me a name, but I was the only one he was yelling at consistently." Oh. So it was things like that happened. And of course, there were many well-documented cases that were, directly, pointing towards the pandemic and the atmosphere that had been whipped up by our former president. And so there were those, and then there were the more amorphous ones that, you have to track backwards and go, "Oh, I think that was it. That was aimed at me."
Exactly. Yeah. So, Ken, what do you want people to take away from listening to Innocent When You Dream?
Well, many things, but for Asian American audiences, I really wanted people to come away with a sense of their parents, their grandparents, as really multidimensional people, who not only went through these things, but it had an effect on them, and that they came from all walks of life, and they responded to this in different ways. And and I wanted a similar thing to reach non-Asian audience, that these were people that happened to do. It wasn't some unfortunate incident in history. These were people. And it was an entire generation that experienced it. Not to mention the Issei generation, the immigrant generation, and that again, they were full-fledged human beings of different walks of life, And I really feel like theater, more than any other art form, can really bring you into people's lives. You're like a fly on the wall, listening to these people's private lives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I thought this was the best way to bring that about.
Well, it's a beautiful play. And thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today and for letting us record Innocent When You Dream.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for producing Innocent When You Dream. I'm so grateful.